First of all, thank you so much for having me. It's been really a pleasure to be here. I'm fully aware that I'm between you and lunch, talking about like machine learning and lots of relatively math-heavy stuff. Do bear with me. I think I'll go under time if it gives you any consolation. So very quickly, who's this person between you and lunch? I am the VP of Data Science at James. Given that the company has a person's name, this is generally more confusing than just not saying anything, so what the hell is James? James is a platform for banks to use machine learning and credit risk. We have actually been around for quite a while, so we're a 2012 startup. And what we do is we help lenders to start using more advanced technologies in the way that they do, especially the risk part of lending. And so the practicalities of that, I won't spend too much on this kind of pitch half, but is that there are a bunch of people who you want to give loans to, and a bunch of people who you probably shouldn't because they don't have the ability to pay you back, either ability or intention, but more often than not ability. And so there are a bunch of systems that all banks have. Some are more sophisticated, some are less, that help them to qualify who should we be giving loans to, who should we not give loans to. And then that gives you an opportunity cost of the people who are like pretty good, but we're saying no because we've got some rule there, and the people who are probably not going to be able to pay back, and we have some rule that says, yeah, this person's fine because of this characteristic or that one, and where they end up not paying, that has a huge cost for the bank. So that's where we play. The other side is a slightly more technical one, which is even when you do have models, banks struggle to deploy them, to like monitor them. So all of these peripheral ops things that you might think of, that's where lots of banks end up struggling. Lots of them have really cool things that they've done in research in some way or another, but then it stays in research because the operations side of this is really, really hard. And so a big part of what we do is actually more of the nuts and bolts of helping them have everything deployed and maintained and running in a way that has to have like this ridiculous level of uptime. And lastly, obviously regulation, right? So we see a lot of companies going to presentations saying, machine learning is easy, every single bank should be using it. The reality is that the biggest constraint that banks perceive, not necessarily that they have, but the biggest constraint that they perceive is what if we suddenly can't explain to a regulator what we're doing? And that's a very good concern to have. And it's one of the things that constrains lots of banks is this regulatory side. So we also kind of a lot of reg tech work in the middle of all of this fintech stuff. And obviously now, because you're fascinated about the operations, which is, it's something that every startup loves to go on stage and talk about themselves forever, so I'll bore you for a few minutes. We started in 2012, which for fintech is really old. This is actually our first team building the prototype. And we started working with banks when machine learning was still kind of this slightly scary, weird thing. And the first ones that adopted it started to see, okay, we're able to get rid of 30% of the bad loans if we use this kind of technology. So it was kind of transformative technology that was then going to become more commoditized as the years went by. We've since grown quite a lot, so now we have headquarters in Lisbon and New York. We're 30-something people, and our core team has, among some VC investors, also a couple of angel investors who work really close with us. One of them is actually the ex-CEO of Credit Suisse, who at one point kind of said, okay, this is super cool, and I'm not sure whether he thinks he's an investor or a founder because he works way more than most investors do, but it's just cool to have like an extended team like that, and this is where I stop pitching, essentially. So I'm going to talk first about the good side of machine learning and what it can bring to lending. The majority of this, though, is probably going to be about the risks, because this talk about how machine learning is great, you've probably heard it before. I think the other half is less heard. This is called, appropriately enough, a confusion matrix. It's a very simple idea. It's on the kind of horizontal. You can see whether you predicted that you should give a loan or you predicted that you shouldn't. And on the vertical one, it's kind of what you observed afterwards, whether you should have or whether you shouldn't. And these are generally represented with like zeros and ones and a bunch of kind of, or with other nomenclature. But I think that works fine if you're in marketing and you're trying to predict whether someone's going to click on something. In risk, I like to do this with a few symbols. So if you predicted that it was a good loan and it was in fact a good loan, then the outcome of that is that someone might get a house, someone might open a business, someone might go to university, someone might be able to do some consumer credit. So some outcome will come of that. If you predict that they are not going to pay you back, but in fact they were, then you've just denied someone the opportunity to get a home or to go to university, and there was no reason realistically for it. It was just that your systems are either too conservative or skewed towards a particular population. This is bad, but the other corner is even worse. So if you predict that they should get a loan and they didn't, that can leave people to go bankrupt, some people to go homeless. Homelessness leads to horrible other problems. So there is it's really important that these things are taken seriously, particularly when we're talking about risk. And again, a lot, unfortunately, of companies who've joined like the machine learning bandwagon in the last few years come in with a slightly Wild West approach that does not consider that essentially this is talking about real lives, and of course, the opposite. And the reason why I'm mentioning this is quite simple. One of the things that we pride ourselves is in being one of the most conservative high-tech startups because we have this map in mind. And it's something that when you are asking a potential company whether you want to work with them and whether they've just done their pitch about how everything is great, there are a few questions that you should probably ask them, considering that this is how important these decisions are. And now, the machine learning side. So machine learning, the joke is like statistics when tons of marketing on top, but the theory is not that complicated, right? So let's say that the horizontal axis is the salary, the vertical axis is, I don't know, how long the person has lived in a particular city. You can, obviously, as humans, we're fantastic at this. We can see, okay, the left side seems to be bad, the right side seems to be good. Pardon for the green and red, by the way, I forgot curl bank, people can't see that, but that was the intended split. And any basic model, this is kind of what banks have used for decades, can just separate those two relatively well and say, okay, this is an area where we're uncertain in the middle, the red area is where we definitely don't want it, the green area is great, and then maybe they decide, depending on their risk appetite, that they lend over 0.2 or 0.1, and then they're able to calculate, like, okay, then what kind of capital requirements do I have, considering that, according to this model, I will have these many defaults during the next N years. And it allows them to essentially buy risk and know, okay, I'm going to make this much money because I'm accumulating this much risk, as long as things don't change too much. Now, this has been used for a really long time. The reason why this has some fragilities is that lots of the realities that we find are not this linear. So here, for anyone who might be colorblind, this is a cross, so top right is red, the bottom right is red, so it's as a cross. And anyone who's seen actual lending data might recognize that, for example, in automobile loans, this is kind of true. It's like younger men tend to be higher risk, but younger women not particularly. So there are like these non-linear patterns where just looking at one thing at a time won't really give you that much information. And here, anything which is not machine learning just completely crashes. It can't fit to this. And anything that is can fit these kind of patterns really, really well, defining some, there's a bit of uncertainty there on the left that doesn't make sense, but it's not really that complicated for a more sophisticated model to go and capture all of that. And so this is pretty much the concepts behind machine learning. Then there's a ton of hype on top of it, but it's finding patterns in data, and then at the end of the day, it is for a human being to decide whether those patterns make sense. And then a couple more examples, just because they're fun. So here is kind of a yin-yang symbol, and again, traditional models can't capture it. More advanced models do these kind of pretty plots. Lastly, one that I really like, which is imagining a circumstance where all of the bad loans are in the middle of the good loans, which I haven't seen yet, where you get these fantastic watermelon kind of things. And it's always good to show someone who's particularly in risk that, okay, maybe your data looks like this crazy watermelon. It's like, so yeah, you might be asking, okay, so what's the consequence of that? You're not expecting me not to use a single GIF. The consequences of using more robust models which have higher flexibility, are that you can essentially turn this into this. So you're never going to be able to completely get rid of all bad loans. The moment you are trying to get completely rid of any bad loan you might ever had, the only way to do that is to not lend at all, but you can definitely improve a lot on your two negative corners. So on the corner where you had a false positive or a false negative. And the more powerful your model, the more of this you can do. It really boils down to that. Most of the technologies that exist that can do this are open source. The ones that are proprietary, that fantastic word, are generally worse than the open source. And so it is an area where anyone who's working in lending can probably start looking at this. There are a number of companies who are working at this. We are obviously one of them, but there are a number of others who do really good work, and trying to test whether these things are working out. And so obviously the question at this point is, well, this all sounds great. This is the traditional machine learning pitch. So are we going to be saved? And well, no, otherwise that would mean that you all got to go to lunch at this point, and that's not my intention here. So the second half of this is about the key mistakes that we want to avoid. And there are quite a number of them, because this all sounds a bit too good to be true, kind of because it is. And the first mistake that we need to avoid is encoding past mistakes. Whatever data a bank has accumulated about the loans that it has given, the ones that went well, the ones that went badly, is almost by definition biased. Not because bias has kind of this weird connotation, right? Not because it's bad data necessarily, but just because of the reality of it. And a lot of what has been happening in the machine learning world is to say, well, this is the way that we as a bank have been lending. We want to kind of encode this, and we want the machine learning model to understand how our underwriters are thinking, et cetera. So any weakness that the underwriter might have is just going to be written into stone. And unfortunately, people don't question algorithms that much, right? So people question people. If I say something stupid, you tend to immediately question and say, no, that doesn't make sense. But strangely, when an algorithm says something stupid, people go, whoa, but the algorithm said it. Even though sometimes it's perfectly moronic. We're intimidated by mathematics. There's something slightly off-putting about challenging something that is somehow a higher power. And algorithms are wrong, very often. And having these past mistakes set in stone is probably one of the weird challenges that we're going to face in the 21st century, where we have over-trusted algorithms to encode things on poor data done by people who maybe didn't know exactly what they were doing. It might have been like, okay, we need to do this by Tuesday. Yeah, we could explore that other path, but we need to close this quickly. Okay, close, and suddenly you've encoded something that no one is going to challenge because it's an algorithm. So you need to be very careful, particularly when making decisions that are going to affect people's lives. And the second one, maybe more surprising to anyone who's not from the field, is that algorithms are idiots. You can think of an algorithm as a really, really clever 3-year-old. What they have, which we don't have, is a fantastic patience. They will go through every single data point, hundreds of thousands, millions of loans, and they will learn from it as much as they can. But they haven't seen much more than that very specific data set. And I'll make this make a bit more sense. One of the things that banks have is data sets about loans they've given, right? However, they don't have any data sets of results of the loans they didn't give. So what starts to happen over time is that you don't really have any really obvious bad loans in your data set, right? Unless you have some underwriter who's just trying to sabotage you, your loans are kind of going to be relatively sensible. And so the thing that these algorithms have to learn from are really quite sensible loans. The extreme cases where someone is unemployed, does not have a salary, has never had a job in their lives, they actually have like a history of credit card fraud, probably that's not even in the data set. You're not giving those kinds of loans out, which might mean that this really, I don't mean this particular kid, by the way, but this particularly intelligent, silly algorithm might be really good in the hard cases and then really suck at the easy ones. And there are a bunch of areas where this becomes fascinating. One of them is in credit card fraud prevention, where fraudsters become increasingly sophisticated and they become really amazing at finding weird ways, highly complicated, where they switch cards constantly and they drive around at a really high speed to cheat the automatic systems. And the systems catch up and start learning all of those really advanced patterns. But because not that many fraudsters are just doing really easy, stupid fraud, it might not catch a completely moronic attempt, which is too easy for an algorithm to have trained on. So this is another thing to always keep in mind, which is they only saw like relatively complicated cases. One which is of very high social importance as well is the question of subgroups. So what am I saying to an algorithm when I'm training it? I'm saying, here's, let's say, 1 million examples, and I want you to do as well as you can on learning these. Now, as well as you can is defined, obviously, mathematically very specifically, but in order to do as well as I can, an algorithm might say, well, there's this little group here, which, to be honest, it doesn't really move the needle. It's relatively small, so I can just get them all wrong, and it seems to get me better on this other population, so I'll just focus on that for now. And mathematically, that is a better result. And we have a tendency as humans to really like single number results, right? We like to say, which of these two algorithms is better? Well, give me a number, and I will choose the one that has the higher number. And very often, the one that has the higher number is quite simply not one that just said, OK, I'm not going to care about these people because they're affecting my metric. I'm just going to focus on this bigger block of the population. And this doesn't really show up very well in overall results. So it's quite easy for a lender not to notice this, generally not even intentionally because it's hidden in the middle of the complexity. And that's a particularly tricky thing to do. And it's something that regulators are paying a lot of attention to. And one of the key balances here needs to be these technologies need to be good for the bank, obviously, and lucrative, but also society needs to gain from that. So the moment that lenders start just saying, OK, well, the model doesn't like this particular subgroup, so we're just going to say no to all of them, and OK, let's focus on the rest, that's when regulators will come in and say, well, this is not going to happen. So it's actually important for everyone to keep those two things in mind. And very related to that, of course, is the questions around discrimination. So models do not care. This is the other thing. You might feel guilty if you're making a decision based on gender, ethnicity, et cetera, because we're not sociopaths. Models kind of are. So if they find a pattern, it might highly correlate with something that we don't want them to see. And it has to be a human to look at it and say, no, that might be a pattern, but it's because of historical reasons, or because of this, or because of that. We don't want to incorporate that. And this is actually one map. This is from the 1940s or 50s, I think, from the US, where there were maps of different areas of population where essentially these were called red lines, where they would generally put lines around generally African-American populations and say, yeah, we don't lend here because this is an entire population that we want to exclude. And this was a big part in American history of the Civil Rights Act and what was called the Fair Credit Opportunities Act, where they essentially said, this is illegal. This it doesn't make sense, but more importantly than that, it's ethically horrible because it will perpetuate the poverty of certain groups, and therefore this is forbidden. So they created this whole thing to avoid red lines and to make sure that people had to explain their models and their decisions and that they made sense. And that worked well for something like 40 years. And then as models started to evolve, some more irresponsible lenders started looking at things such as, oh, let's just see all of the buying patterns that someone might have. And it's buying patterns. That sounds like something that should go into credit. And machine learning models were depressingly good in backtests at just using digital red lines, figuring out what kind of shampoos people from different ethnicities use. And then you can definitely make, oh, but we're just looking at buying patterns and stuff. But if you don't have the care of looking, but is this accidentally creating red lines, then you actually end up in a very tricky moral situation. So another key part is, I'm not even talking about deliberate discrimination, I'm talking about accidental discrimination, making sure that your lending operation is not accidentally redlining entire populations, because in the pattern of data that you might have, maybe historically there is something there, but it is the kind of data that you do not want to use. The other one, we've kind of touched on this one before, which is the questions around black boxes. So we have a certain idolatry of the machine, right? For some reason, we have one of the best models in the world. We have freaking neural networks in our brain, which are more powerful than any computer that's out there, not in terms of CPU, but in terms of generalizing well. And we still tend to say, but the model said that X and Y. Recently, another American example, there was a company that went up to the US justice system and said, the way that you are deciding who needs to go to prison to wait for trial and who gets to go free is super complicated and biased. We'll just use machine learning, and it will help you decide who should go to prison and who should go free. And what they ended up creating was the most racist algorithm that has probably ever existed, which has essentially been deciding for quite a while now whether people get to wait for their trial free or in prison. And it's depressing that we still fall for this mistake of assuming that a black box knows better than we do. And in lending, it just always goes back to this, right? Just you go to a lending operation or to a bank and ask, I would like a loan, please. Here are my characteristics. And the person just completely gives responsibility to the model and says, oh, the computer says no. Oh, but the system, it's the system, the system. And that gives you no right of redress and a bunch of other problems. In Europe and the US, this is mostly illegal. However, particularly in emerging markets, this is going to start becoming a really big issue where people just kind of completely lose the right to redress. And that's basically because of laziness and incompetence on the part of the technology providers, because there is quite a lot of technology that's very useful for avoiding this problem. This is a slightly more visual part. I'll go into the credit example, but this is the one that I love, which is as you probably know, neural networks can tell cats from dogs. But as of last year, you can also ask, but why do you think that it is a cat, and but why do you think that it is a dog? So they can kind of return the concept of dogginess to you and say, oh, I think it's a dog because of this bit. And you can then expand that to other things, such as, why do you think that this is this type of bird and not that one? And it will point maybe at a few specks that you wouldn't even have thought of noticing. And then you go, oh, yeah, actually, he's right. Whenever it has the specks, it is that bird. Also very good at telling leopards from cheetahs and stuff that I can't do. And so back to the case around lending. So if you're lending, instead of saying computer says no, you can now do something which is much more interesting, which is, okay, here are the things that counted against you. Here are actually the things that counted for you. And by the way, and this is where you can then actually make some money off of this, which is, by the way, here's a way for us to get you to a yes. We would need a guarantor who has at least this salary, or I can't give you a loan this year, but I can see here that if we wait another year, then this would consider that that you've crossed a certain threshold because you've been employed for at least 4 years. So you actually can recover some business out of this, but also crucially, you're able to inform the person of why you're declining a loan. Also, if you're declining them a loan and they have other products with you, it is not that unlikely that they will say, well, you're not my friendly bank. You always made this advertising that you were on my side. You're not even telling me why you're denying, so I'm moving elsewhere. These explainability methods help a lot to avoid churn and to avoid annoying your clients. The other, I think there are like 2 more of these. The other side of it is the world model. So this is a relatively complex idea, but I can actually give you a real example that we saw a couple of years ago. As you might imagine, the salary that someone makes is really, really highly correlated with their expenses, right? But we generally accept that having a higher salary makes you safer, but spending more money, probably for the same salary, makes you less safe for a loan. However, there's a really high correlation between your salary and your expenses. We as human beings have a world model that makes us think, yeah, but it's the salary that matters, not the expenses. Whereas machine learning algorithms do not have that world model. So you saw a lender that actually had been experimenting with this kind of technology, and what they ended up with was, we have a model that says the bigger the expenses, the better. And it really explained their historical data, because, again, correlated with salary. However, when a new person came in and they kind of looked at their model, they would say, well, yeah, your salary is this, and your expenses is that. I can only really give you a loan if you start spending like double the amount of money that you're spending on the same salary. And that's what their model was saying. It was nonsensical, and we as human beings can think, that's clearly wrong. But from an algorithm's point of view, that's what it wanted. It wanted bigger expenses because historically expenses had been good. So this whole thing of explainability is not just important from a fluffy point of view of, oh, but we need to be open about it. It's also super important in just debugging and making sure your models are not completely insane. And a lot of technology providers will give you insane models because it's cheap and easy for them, and they can still sell you that in a very expensive way. So it's super important to prioritize explainability. So this is just one example of, I won't go into the details of this, but it's essentially having the human intuition of things mixed in with the data. So a human can go and say, I don't care what the data tells you, expenses is smaller is better, and that's that. Now figure out the best model that mixes the data you've seen with this intuition that I've given you. We've touched on the question of complacency, but I think it's really important. technology will not replace the humans in a risk department. The humans in a risk department are there to make sure that whatever the commercial incentives are kept in check with the defensive needs of the bank. There's a reason why 2008 went absolutely horrible, and that was partially because risk stopped being risk and risk started being just pure business. And risk is not business. Risk is, let's make sure that things are safe, and then once everything is safe, let's try and make as much business as we can. And when those two things get mixed, it gets really dangerous. So it's particularly dangerous when machine learning companies who propose a risk model to you say, by the way, we can make this risk model extremely lucrative. Because what that does is it increases the upside and it massively increases the downside. So the next time there's a turn in the credit cycle, and it's probably not that far off, some lenders who've just been massively over-leveraged because they were complacent and just trusting some crazy models, some lenders are going to go under. That's just, I actually expect that. The complacency that people have put into black box models and into some nonsense that has not been properly shown how they work, that had no explainability, that had no reporting, that had no monitoring, those lenders are not prepared in any way to deal with the next turn in a credit cycle, which is a worrying concept considering that we've kind of seen what happened with the last one. And to end on a completely, smiley, giggly note, there's also the question of essentially data-driven dystopias, right? So what you see now in China, I presume many people will have seen that ad, not an ad, sorry, the video in a Chinese train where there are a few people on the train and the sound system goes on and reminds passengers that their behavior on the train will affect their credit score. There's a really, really dark side to what can happen if you just start tracking everyone's lives and forcing them to optimize for credit risk. So I've seen, for example, people ask, but is it okay to use Facebook and LinkedIn data in credit risk and in deciding whether people should get a loan or not? And then you consider, well, then maybe that means that poor people will start to have to choose who they make friends with because their credit risk might go down. So there's a lot of things where it is crucial that society plays an active role and thinks about what we want to allow to go into these systems and what we do not. And even though there are companies who end up taking a lot of responsibility for these kind of things, so actually James is an example of that, where we are actively talking to the US regulators and to national regulators throughout Europe about what they should be careful with, what they actually need to forbid companies from doing, etc. It really cannot be the technologists legislating themselves. It's a very weird incentive structure. And because currently the non-techies are so intimidated by this type of technology, it is putting a weird onus on the industry to self-regulate when the incentives are kind of to be the most Wild West possible. And I think that is one thing that maybe I would like to leave here, which is it is kind of everyone's responsibility to take action on deciding which of these parts are good, which of these parts are bad, whether banks should be forced to use explainability if they're going to use machine learning. All of these questions I'm deliberately leaving open because at the end of the day, it shouldn't be the industry deciding, it should be you. And so that is kind of what I wanted to say in conclusion. There's really good reasons for using machine learning in lending. There definitely is. It will make the lending world safer. It will diminish the number of people who don't get to have credit, who do get to have a house, a business, go to university, because credit is great. It would also avoid a lot of credit that should not be given out. And so machine learning is definitely a positive thing for lending. What it cannot be is a Wild West where people just trust algorithms blindly, where we don't second guess what the machine is telling us, where we don't think that things need to be explainable. If you make sure that next time someone comes to you with a sales pitch, you ask some of these tricky questions, you'll be able to tell which are the good machine learning companies, and there are quite a few out there, from the ones that are just selling you some pipe dream. Thank you. I don't know if there's any questions on this. I don't know if we're doing questions. I know I'm right before lunch, so it's always a tricky time to do. I think there's one over there.
Hello. First of all, thank you for one of the best talks here, in my opinion. It was very nice.
Thank you.
Your last line was that we as a society as a whole should decide what should be the good factors for the machine learning algorithms to decide on what is a positive or negative decision on a credit. How do you see this happening? Because a lot of people does not understand what goes on in these algorithms and does not even know how to voice their opinion. Should there be like some kind of a platform, maybe like, well, this is a blockchain conference, so maybe some kind of a blockchain solution where banks should I don't know, publish the data behind the decisions or something like that, and then we as a society could see it and react to it, especially the experts in this area that could be the voice for all other.
So there's a good argument for that, and there's a good argument against that. One of the concerns that, in terms of the banks being able to publish exactly how their system works and allowing anyone to check it, I personally like that idea. It has one downside, which is that banks are also defending themselves from fraudsters. So they also try to keep a level of secrecy around their core models. As an example, yeah, I shouldn't probably tell you a really easy way to do fraud in banking while I'm on a conference. Anyway.
You can kill me afterwards.
Yeah, I just paused myself at that point. But they're relatively easy, and you can probably figure this out, that in some of the traditional models that are out there, if you look at them and you think about it for a second, you'll realize, wait, does that mean that someone who has been in their job for like only a few days and the salary is temporarily this because they've just received maybe a stay bonus or something? So does that mean that they can just ask for any loan right there, even though they would be denied one day later and one day after? So they're like all of these weird edge cases. In traditional models, even more than in machine learning models, which make the banks quite hesitant to be too open because they know that it would be exploitable. Now, again, if a regulatory agency came out and said, well, in 3 years you'll need to explain your algorithm, so start getting rid of your edge cases, maybe that would actually be a good thing because it would force them to solidify their models. But there's kind of a good argument both ways. Regarding the need for blockchain, there is definitely an interesting argument for it, so that a bank is forced to keep all of their decisions in a traceable and highly immutable way. It is actually possibly even a good idea in the cases where banks are using like human underwriters. So one example that unfortunately still happens a lot in the States is that maybe a human underwriter has a preference for a certain gender or for a certain ethnicity. And maybe if they know that this decision is immutable and verifiable and that they will develop a pattern over years where someone can go and say, wait, this person's only given loans to white, tall guys in the last 3 years? That's kind of weird. So maybe just having that transparency would actually help. But at the end of the day, it's always a weird balance between security and transparency while this kind of thing goes on.
Thank you.
I actually can't see you, so if there's anyone with a mic. No, looks like we're good. 10 minutes over. Thank you.